and welcome to another installment of our lecture series here in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Macau. Today, we are joined virtually by Professor Chloe Balla, who is a professor of ancient philosophy at the University of Crete in Greece. Among other things, Professor Balla is the director of the Philosophical Research and Translation Lab, or UCRC, secretary of the Center of Greek and Chinese Ancient Civilizations. She's published many well-known works, among them Platonic Persuasion from Rhetoric to Statecraft in 1997, The Sophists and Socrates in 2023, that's a co-authored work with Calliope Papamanoli, and a translation of Aristotle's Constitution of the Athenians in 2015. This is in addition to numerous articles and editorships and co-editorships. She has had positions such as a visiting fellow position at the Center for Hellenic Studies in Harvard, the Seeger Center for Hellenic Studies in Princeton, and at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. Today, Professor Balla is presenting a talk to us by the title Plato and Plato's Socrates on Mythmaking. So without further ado, let us all welcome Professor Balla, and I will hand things over.
So thank you very much for this very warm introduction. I'm jealous I'm not with you. I feel I've met a lot of people from Macau, I mean, late in my life, but I want to thank you all for the invitation, and especially Dimitra Marandidou, whom I met over Zoom and here in Greece, and then in Rome at the World Congress of Philosophy, like other members of your department. Yes, I hope to meet the rest of you soon in Greece, maybe, or in China. But it will be a pleasure for us to meet more and more Chinese students in Greece. So I hope we will be in touch about prospects of further collaboration. I'm very happy to be able to give you this talk, which is part of it is part of it has to do with my current research on a book on Plato's Phaedo. And part of it I adjusted so that I give people who are not very familiar with Greek philosophy, as I'm not very familiar with Chinese philosophy, to be able to follow. And I'm also very happy to see that your department is a Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, because as you will see, a lot of what I will be talking about will be related to questions of atheism, actually. So I have asked Ben to send you the slides, and he can still do it. So if you want to follow something that I'm pronouncing in English in a way that you're not familiar with, I'm not a native speaker myself, so I just want to make sure that what I'm saying is can be understood by you. So we'll speak for an hour, I guess, and then we will have time for discussion, right, Ben?
That's right. That's right. Just under an hour.
I start with some background here. 399 before Christ, or before Common Era, as many of our colleagues say today. In 399 BC, this comes from the beautiful article by Joshua Ober, Socrates and Democratic Athens. And in the end of my presentation, there is a short bibliography that you can refer to it if you want to more information about my approach. So in 399 before Christ BC, the Athenian citizen Socrates was tried by an Athenian court on the charge of impiety, asebeia. He was found guilty by a narrow majority of the empaneled judges and executed in the public prison a few days later. The trial and execution constitute the best documented events in Socrates' life and a defining moment in the relationship between Greek philosophy and Athenian democracy. Ever since, philosophers and historians have sought to explain troubling aspects of the case. Why was Socrates, the philosophical model of a good man, charged with public wrongdoing? I'm reading the text of the indictment, which is preserved by Favorinus in later centuries. Could see it in the Mitron, in the index that was still preserved, and Diogenes Laertius gives us the evidence for that. The affidavit in the case, which is still preserved, says Favorinus, in the Mitron, ran as follows. This indictment and affidavit is sworn by Melitus, the son of Melitus of Pythos, against Socrates, the son of Sophroniscus of Allopeki. Nothing of this is important for my talk. The details. Socrates is guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state, by the polis, and of introducing other new divinities, which is what I will be talking to you in a moment. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. I'm not going to be talking to you about this. The penalty demanded is death. So I'm stressing the fact that the only historical piece of evidence from Socrates we have is the text of the indictment in order to draw attention to the well-known problem of accuracy of our literary sources, that is, of the dialogues his students composed after his death, but also the comedy of Aristophanes, which was performed during his lifetime. So the Socrates about whom I'm going to talk to you today is not the historical Socrates. Maybe he is, but I don't know it, and you don't know. But mainly Plato's persona of his teacher, and I will be focusing on two of Plato's texts, the Phaedo, which is the dialogue that recounts Socrates' last day on earth, and the Timaeus, I will be talking less about that, which is not exactly a dialogue, but mostly a speech on natural science that the philosopher and statesman from Locri in present-day Italy presents to Socrates. I'm using these two texts in order to contrast, but also to connect Socrates' dream, vision about, but also an achieved vision regarding the future of natural science. So before he dies, Plato says he kept complaining about the state of natural science. And I also want to connect this with Plato's unprecedented contribution to natural science. So in the Timaeus, Plato's work, there is a new vision almost accomplished for natural science, which, as we shall see, is characteristically cast in the language of myth. So Plato says, this is not an exact story. This is not a scientific account, as we would say today. We don't have evidence really, but it is a very important, let's say, myth. He uses the word myth, and hence the title of my presentation. According to the interpretation I propose, Plato uses Socrates' claim in the beginning of the Phaedo that he himself was not an expert in myth-making, we will come back to that, as a springboard for the myth in which Timaeus, who is presumably Plato's spokesman, casts his explanation of the natural world. So toward the end of my talk, I will be contrasting Socrates' claim, I'm not an expert in myth, with the fact that there was this man, Timaeus, from present-day Italy, who tells Socrates, who teaches Socrates, the kind of story that Socrates, was not able to come across while in his lifetime. Outline of my talk. I start with some remarks on the background of atheism or impiety, and which was one of the two charges that of Socrates' indictment. And Socrates, that is the historical Socrates' possible rapport with atheistic ideas. Why was he accused of atheism? Then I move on to some remarks on the background of the indictment, refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state, and of introducing other new divinities, or this is the same point. And Miriam Kotwick has a recent article. It's at the end of your bibliography. You can take a note if you want to learn more about 5th century atheistic ideas This is a great piece, and it's a great topic also. I then want to move to Xenophon's apologetic agenda. So now Xenophon is also a Socratic author, a student of Socrates, who was a general. He was in the military. He was a general for a big army that went to Asia while Socrates was indicted and died. But then he wrote the Memorabilia, a story, a long story about with his memories of Socrates. And I'm using Xenophon's text as a foil to contrast to Plato's apologetic agenda. So both Xenophon and Plato, I think, and everybody thinks, want to tell a story about why their teacher was innocent. For Plato, I start with a so-called intellectual autobiography, which is the text that I asked your professor to distribute, because it's a very interesting and rich text. We will be reading it together also. I start with this text from the Phaedo, which is a text that Plato attributes to his teacher Socrates. And the Phaedo is, as I already said, the dialogue which recounts Socrates' last day on earth. So I take this important on Plato's, from Plato's point of view, to show, he died. The day he died, he still wasn't able to see one person who could give him the right kind of account about natural science. Then I explain how Timaeus' mythological account in the Timaeus, a dialogue that postdates the Phaedo, answers Socrates' concerns. Following David Sedley, you will see it in the bibliography, I then go back to the final myth of the Phaedo, and I show how that myth contains the seeds of the kind of teleological explanation that we find in the Timaeus. So already in the Phaedo, Plato makes Socrates say, I have a vague idea of what that could be about. I'm not sure about it. Someone told me about it. We will come back to that. Again, following Sedley, I suggest that the unnamed informant that Socrates invokes, that's somebody that told him Socrates about it, his source for the content of the myth is Plato himself, that Plato, the author, shows that Socrates heard from Plato what kind of way the natural science should follow. And Plato, of course, wants to claim that he was Socrates' most successful successor. I then return to the beginning of the dialogue, the Phaedo, and that's my contribution. I offer a new interpretation of Socrates' claim concerning his own lack of expertise in myth-making. So a lot of things, but I hope you will be able to follow. So, general background on atheism, just to give you an idea of how radical ideas in 5th century Athens, which is the century where Socrates was, when Socrates was still flourishing, right? He's condemned at the end of this century, right? We count backwards. I mean, from 5th, 4th comes after 5th. So a passage from a satire play. I will spare you the details. Most people, I think, today think it's Critias. Critias comes from Socrates' environment. He's a tyrant, so there is a political association here. But what I want to focus on is the content. It's an interesting, original, but also potentially threatening ideas for a traditional audience, let's say. Some clever man introduced the divine. So the divine was man-made, the idea of a god, saying that there is a deity endowed with immortal life, who with his mind hears, sees, understands, and takes account of these things, and who bears a divine nature, one who is going to hear everything said about mortals and be able to see everything they do. If you plan some misdeeds silently, this will not escape the gods' notice, for there is exceptional power of understanding in them. So, someone from Socrates' environment, milieu, introduces to the Athenians ideas that are very radical and potentially dangerous, let's say. It's a big question, what exactly happens with atheistic ideas in 5th century Athens, but I'm not going to dwell on that. I just want to stress how important it is and how Socrates himself, I mean the historical Socrates, could easily be related to this background. So Socrates, we know that from our sources, was a student of Archelaus. And Archelaus is a student of Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras, 5th century, the first pre-Socratic philosophy who makes a career, let's say, in Athens. And he's an advisor of the important statesman Pericles. I'm reading just the fragments to give you an idea. Anaxagoras says that the moon is a fiery solid possessing in itself plains, mountains, and I can't read this. It doesn't matter. As I said, I'm not a native speaker. Anaxagoras was followed by his disciple Archelaus. You see the pedigree, right? Anaxagoras, Archelaus, and the Socrates. He too, Archelaus too, thought that all the things that come to be are composed of particles similar to each other, but in such a way, he said, that mind, mens, this is from a Latin source, is also present in them. And then we hear that Archelaus, Socrates' teacher, said that God is air and mind, but mind is not what made the world. So what I want to establish is that there is a debate, there is a discussion, a lot of original ideas of what the world consists in. And the traditional ideas about gods being the supernatural entities, I guess, is abandoned by these intellectuals that we describe as philosophers later on. And of course, a bright man like Aristophanes, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Aristophanes, who wrote comedies like The Clouds, which is one of the sources, our sources about Socrates, but then it is a comedy, everybody says, it's a satire, but then no comedy or no satire can be funny enough if the audience cannot understand what it satirizes about a historical person. I mean, you can think of a satire, of a comedy, something on the television that you see, and it's a comment on some political figure. To make people laugh, there has to be something connected to the figure, the historical figure that you can understand. And this is Socrates in The Clouds, Aristophanes' Clouds, but he appears to come in a very fancy, for the time, basket. He comes in the scene of the theater. So it was a very important and influential play. Influential. It made an impact to Athenians. And let me also add that the theater in Athens was something that where Athenians were learned about everything, were educated, exposed to new ideas, because it was a public event, a huge event. People could go there for free. They didn't have computers. They didn't have platforms to download movies. So they just went to the theater. That's how they were educated. Why am I saying this? Because for the average Athenian, it is likely that Socrates was the person that I will just now that I will explain in the next slide. So this is from Aristophanes' Clouds. It's Socrates speaking. Zeus is the head of the gods, the 12 gods of Olympus. Don't be absurd. Zeus doesn't exist. Strepsiades is a student in his academy, let's say. Who is it that makes rain then, says Strepsiades. Socrates replies, why, the clouds, of course. I'll prove it to you. Does it ever rain without the clouds? No. And you would have thought that Zeus could have made rain on his own if he so desired, without the help of the clouds. You can trace something like a scientific reasoning, right? So it's you bring in the clouds, and it's a chorus of men who just push one another, and it's the mechanical aspect that is underscored with this new kind of teaching. Strepsiades is a student, and he says, and I always thought that it was Zeus pissing through a sieve. You certainly have a way with words that makes completely sense. But hold on, what makes the thunder that makes me shake and terror in terror? Zeus, you see the first image, it is often, you find it often in Greek vases, but it's also reproduced, as you see, in modern imagination, was the one who held the thunder traditionally. And Socrates replies, Socrates replies, it is just the clouds rocking in the sky. Strepsiades, is nothing sacred. How do they do that? And Socrates says, simple. When they become completely saturated with moisture, they are forced by necessity to begin to oscillate and to, I miss something, every now and again, they ram each other, and of course, being packed with precipitation, crash, a cloud burst. So it's all mechanical, it's all physical. This is where the word physis, nature, comes from. Forget about traditional gods. So let's agree that Socrates, in people's imagination, let's say, or in their memories also, because it's maybe 25 years between when the clouds was staged and when Socrates was condemned to death. I'm not going to talk about the politics of the trial. One day I will come to Macau and tell you about it, or you can easily find it on the internet also. But what I want to stress now is how his two major, I mean, major in the sense that we have a lot of text by them, because Socrates had other students of whom we don't have, we only have fragments. So Xenophon on the one hand and Plato on the other apologized for their student, found a way to tell their contemporaries that no, he was not, well, see, the indictment was not that he was not an atheist, really. It was that he introduced new gods. But both Plato and Xenophon at least can prove, can claim, are interested to suggest that Socrates was pious. So let's go to Xenophon first. So Xenophon, in his Memorabilia, his Memories of Socrates, says, in general, with regard to the phenomena of the heavens, he deprecated curiosity. He said it's not good to be curious. Deprecated curiosity to learn how the deity contrives them. He held that the secrets could not be discovered by man, and believed that any attempt to search out what the gods had not chosen to reveal must be displeasing to them. Think of the contrast, right, between the way Aristophanes presents Socrates as a radical thinker, saying there is no Zeus, and Xenophon says, no, he had nothing to do with that. On the contrary, he told his students, never do research on things that the gods do not want you to know about. He said that anyone who meddles with these matters runs the risk of losing his sanity as completely as Anaxagoras. So Xenophon is explicit. He didn't want to be like Anaxagoras. And Anaxagoras, Xenophon says that he took an insane pride in his explanation of the divine machinery. So this is Xenophon, very straightforward. Aristophanes says Socrates is a radical atheist. He brings in new ideas that have to do with natural science. Of course, you remember, let me see how I go back. Socrates was also a student of Archelaus, and probably the audience of Aristophanes were aware that Socrates was a student of someone who said, look at the last line of the slide, mind is not what made the world, even if God is air and mind. So a lot of radical ideas there, and the Athenians are likely to associate these radical ideas with Socrates, since Socrates is a student of Archelaus. And Xenophon, as a student who apologizes for Socrates, says, no, this is all lying. Socrates, on the contrary, didn't want to have anything with Anaxagoras and Archelaus. I guess saying, look, they lost their mind. Gods do not want you to understand things that they will not reveal to you. Let's move on to Plato now. So Plato writes this dialogue, the Phaedo, explaining what exactly happened the last day of Socrates' life. It's interesting that he gives a lot of details, but I remember once hearing a very interesting lecture by a psychologist on lying, who was saying how important it is when you lie to give a lot of details. So you make people, you convince them that you know what you're talking about. So you say, yeah, I was wearing a blue jacket. I remember that. Yes. And it was raining. Irrelevant. But you make people think that this actually happened. So Plato writes this story, is at least what I'm saying now, about the last day of his teacher's life, last day of his teacher's life. And what I'm saying is that it's a manifesto. I mean, it's not just me. I want to stress it to you, because you read it and you say, it is the story of the last day of Socrates' life, and you can still find this in older books. So the current interpretation, what people are more happy with today, and I think it makes sense, is that Plato uses the Phaedo as a manifesto of Plato's vision for philosophy, which he makes Socrates introduce as a project. So I wish someone could do this, is what Socrates says before he dies. And the audience of the dialogue can easily think, maybe Plato is in a position to do that. So I will read, yes, I will read it, but you already have it, so we'll just read through it. The text where that is usually described as Socrates' intellectual autobiography, where Socrates, according to Plato, is putting his finger on the problems with natural science, with contemporary natural science, including Anaxagoras. So we already saw Xenophon saying that Socrates had nothing to do with Anaxagoras. Don't believe what they're saying. He was not. He was a very pious man. Plato chooses a different strategy, and what he says is, one day I heard somebody reading from what he said was a book by Anaxagoras. Some people say that this is Archelaus. So, but let's leave this out. I just want to remind you that Archelaus, who's Anaxagoras' student, is a teacher of Socrates. And Plato makes Socrates complain in the following way. So Anaxagoras was saying that it turns out to be intelligence, nous, that both orders things and is cause of everything. I was pleased with this cause, and it struck me that in a way it is good that intelligence should be cause of everything. And suppose that, if this is the case, when intelligence is doing the ordering, it orders everything and assigns each thing in whatever way is best. It's not a random physical thing. There is some kind of morality behind. And I gave you also this in the abstract I sent to you before, this line by Cicero saying how Socrates brought down philosophy from the heavens to the earth, introducing morality, introducing this kind of question. So I thought, says Socrates, should someone want to discover the cause of how each thing comes to be, perishes, or is, this is what he must find out about it, how it is best for it either to be or to, how it is best for it either to be or to act or be acted upon in any other respect whatsoever. What is more, on this theory, a human being should consider nothing other than what it is optimal or best. Everything about morality, let's say, also, I mean, under certain reading, but we can come back to discussion to this. concerning both that thing itself and everything else. The same person is bound to know the worst too, for it is the same knowledge that concerns them both. So by reasoning like this, I thought to my delight that I had found in Anaxagoras a teacher of the cause of things who fitted my own intelligence. But I suppose that he would tell me first whether the earth was flat or round, and when he had done so, would also explain the cause that necessitated it, saying what was better that is that the earth should be like this. We will come back to this point and we will see what an explanation of the sort of explanation that Socrates thinks is fitting would look like. And if he had said that it was in the center, he would also explain, I thought, that it was better, that it should be in the center. If he showed me these things, I was ready to stop wishing for any other kind of cause. In particular, I was equally ready to learn about the sun in that way, and about the moon and the other celestial bodies, about their relative speed and turnings and the other things they underwent, namely how it is better that each of them should both act and be acted upon as it is. For given his claim that they have been ordered by intelligence, I never thought that he would introduce a cause for them other than its being best that they should be as they are. So I suppose that when he assigned the cause to each of them and in common to them all, he would also explain what was best for each and the good common to them all. And I wouldn't have signed away my hopes for a large sum, but I got hold of his books with real excitement and started reading them as quickly as I could, so that I might know as quickly as possible what was best and what was worse. But then, my friend, I was swept away from my marvelous expectations, for as I went on reading it, I saw the man making no use of his intelligence and not laying any causes at its door with regard to ordering things, but assigning the causality to air, ether, water, and the like, as well as many other oddities. Those of you who are familiar with Aristotle's natural science know that Aristotle would describe this as material causes. So Anaxagoras and the Pre-Socratics only worried about the material causes, using Aristotle's vocabulary in an anachronistic way. Socrates gives an interesting analogy with his case, and how this kind of explanation would be like saying that the reason why Socrates has not chosen to escape was that his body was too heavy and his bones were behaving in this way. But what we really want is why it was good. Why was it the best choice, which is what you figure out with your intellect. For by the dog, I think these sinews and bones would long have been in Megara or Boeotia, Boeotia is the Greek, transported by an opinion as to what is best, if I didn't think it more just and honorable to suffer whatever punishment the city imposes. Now, calling such things causes is extremely odd. But if someone said that without having such things, bones, sinews, and whatever else I have, I wouldn't be able to do what I have decided, he'd be telling the truth. However, saying that it is on account of them that I do what I do, rather than because of my choice of what is best, despite the fact that I act because of intelligence, that would be a profoundly careless way to talk. Okay, let me not read the whole thing since I already gave it to you, but please bear in mind that what we have here is Socrates anticipating the kind of account of natural science that Timaeus, Plato's spokesman, we have no evidence for Timaeus being a historical figure, the kind of natural science that he would later present to him. Maybe you're already asking, how is it later since he will be dying in 10 minutes? Well, this is literature. I mean, it's philosophy, but also literature. So I think that Plato knows that his readers, his audience, understand that he can reflect on what could have happened and how could someone from a Pythagorean maybe background like Timaeus give Socrates what he was never able to get during his lifetime. Again, we can come back to this in discussion. Now, because that was a long passage, I will read a little bit. I have made some points that I want to go over with you. What is Socrates trying to do there? Plato, Socrates. What is Plato doing? Shows that Socrates had some interest in natural science, but was able to put his finger exactly on the problems that Xenophon Socrates had stressed. The proper account of the physical world should somehow reveal the importance of presumably divine intelligence in its composition or creation. And this is part of this is a part of Xenophon that we haven't discussed, so we can come back to in discussion with that. So that such interest was compatible with natural science, since there were people like Anaxagoras who introduced the idea of intelligence as the cause of the universe or the cosmos. In fact, some scholars have suggested that someone who handed the book to Socrates was his teacher, Archelaus. He stresses the importance of the higher kind of cause, the good above everything. He acknowledges the importance of auxiliary causes as necessary causes. And he shows that Socrates, right before he died, expressed his hope that someone would eventually be able to provide the kind of cause that natural scientists in his own lifetime had not been able to develop, which points to Plato as his most successful student. So let me now move on to a passage from the Timaeus, which is very much discussed in the bibliography. This is from an article by Miles Perniet, his translation. It's just to give you an idea of how in this style, Timaeus, who is probably a Pythagorean from Italy, for sure, that's how Plato wants to describe him. Italy being the part of Hellas, Greece back then, were a colonies that Plato visited after Socrates' death, and presumably became familiar and more familiar with these ideas about natural science and how mathematics is behind the cosmos. Cosmos is this harmony. I mean, we find this throughout pre-Socratic philosophy. But Plato goes there and comes back and writes a lot of texts, including the Phaedo, presumably. But later on, he writes the Timaeus, where he makes Timaeus contrast a kind of account that has the strictness, a complete strictness, and cannot account for the natural world. I mean, it's not like today's physics, right? And a more, let's say, a mythical account, which is legitimate, which is important, and which shows how why things were made in the best possible way, which is what Socrates had longed for. So I'm not going to read this. It's there for you. You can have the PowerPoint presentation to go back and read it yourselves. But what I want to stress is that in the Timaeus, Plato gives this way out. He says, look, we can talk about natural science in a form of a myth, an amazing myth that has God in it, the divine, the demiurge, the creator God. This is something that already we find in Xenophon, and this is a passage that I said I skipped in the interest of time. So Plato says, look, I found the way, I found the answer that I was looking for. I'm the best. And this is written, the Timaeus is written after the Phaedo. So what I want to do now is to go to the Phaedo and and look at the passage in which, toward the end of the dialogue, it's part of what we describe as the eschatological myth, what happens in the afterlife, and Socrates tells his students how he thinks that what he's going to encounter, what it looks like. So the story of the Phaedo basically is that I'm going to die, but I don't worry, I don't care. The soul is immortal, and I will go to the afterlife, which will be even better. I will be among philosophers, and I will get rid of my body. And think about how Plato can marry, can combine this kind of agenda with an agenda about natural science. What is your body? What, you still are an embodied being. Yes, I can become disembodied, but even when I'm embodied, my soul is a different thing, a separate thing. And this is the first account, long account of dualism in the Greek, classical Greek philosophy. So toward the end of this text, which has received much attention in philosophy for the reasons I just explained, Socrates says, I've been convinced first. So Socrates says that he heard from someone, an unnamed informant, a story about what the world looks like and how you can explain it. And he says, I've been convinced first that if the earth is round and in the middle of the heaven, it has no need of air or any other such necessity to stop it falling, but the uniformity of the heaven on every side and the equilibrium of the earth itself are enough to hold it in place. The reason is that if a thing in equilibrium is put in the middle of something uniform, it will not be able to lean more or less in any direction, but in its uniform state, it will stay in place without leaning. Well, then, he said, that is the first thing of which I have been convinced. I'm not reading to you the whole text, but what I want to suggest, following here David Sedley, is that in this text, in a very rough way, it's like Socrates anticipates what Plato is going to establish. And I'm reading from this marvelous book. We have translated it in modern Greek. I don't know if it is translated in Chinese also. Maybe it is, because I know that David Sedley has come and given lectures at Renmin. This book that is called Creation and Its Critics in Antiquity. I'm reading from this book. Clearly, Socrates does not fully, Socrates, right, the character in Plato's Phaedo, does not fully see the teleological subtext of the myth, since he has earlier confessed to never having learned how to do teleological cosmology. So, are you familiar with this term teleology, that seeking the telos, which is the end, the good end, the best end, an explanation that reveals why a cause is fulfilling the best possible outcome. And as you remember, this is what Plato, Socrates complained about, that nobody told me about that. Anaxagoras, he said something about design, the intellect, and then he says, it's just the whirls and the waters and things being heavy. I don't want that. I want some explanation of why it is best for the earth to be in the middle of the universe. So, Sedley says, Socrates goes to his death without retracting this disavowal. We know that Socrates is disappointed. His declared readiness to believe the myth no doubt springs from his belief in divine justice, not from any skill in cosmology. But whoever told him the myth, a person to whom he refers just as someone, must have had a significantly better understanding of teleological cosmology than he himself did. Who is this anonymous informant? My own candidate, says Sedley, is Plato himself. So, to sum up until now, what I have tried to show is to give you the background of what I'm going to introduce now as my interpretation, which is Plato apologizing for Socrates, but at the same time, Plato wanting to claim that he, Plato, is his best student. The day in the prison, actually, Plato the author says that he was not present, which is, again, an interesting hint that I'm making this story up, right? The author is not present. Who was present? Everybody, all of his other students were present. So it's again like Plato saying, there were all these other guys who were following Socrates, but of course, Plato is the best. I cannot argue for this right now. I can come back to this discussion, but I think it's a trend in, not a trend, but one of the things Plato does is to show his rivalry also with other Socratics. In the beginning of this dialogue, no, let me sum up what I've done so far. So I talked to you about why Socrates likely was thought of as an atheist, of someone who was not pious enough. We have Aristophanes' story. I told you that this is not completely made up because he's a student of Archelaus. So the Athenians had reasons to think of Socrates as an atheist. And then Xenophon said, but no, he didn't want Anaxagoras, people like natural philosophers. No, he said, never meddle with divine things. Forget about that. Just go and sacrifice and discuss with your students. Plato comes along and he says, no. What he said really was that he would happily be a student of natural science if natural science could somehow marry natural science with something about the divinity and some explanations that factor in the best possible, why ours is the best possible world, let's say. And that's how Plato describes Socrates. And in the end of this dialogue, where he makes Socrates complain at the last day of his life that, no, I never encountered this kind of natural explanation, and I would happily become the student of anyone like Plato or Timaeus who were able to do that. Plato says he heard this story about how the earth stays in the middle from someone else. Maybe that was Plato. It's a story. It's a myth. A myth is what Timaeus presents to Socrates also. Socrates, on the other hand, was not a myth maker, and this is my upshot. So in the very beginning of this dialogue, the Phaedo, Plato gives us a lot of details that make us think that it is probably a true story. Anytus was wondering, and can you please tell me what to tell Anytus? What is this dream about? So people skip the beginning often or give it different interpretations, which have nothing to do with what I'm about to suggest. So Socrates tells us in the beginning of the Phaedo about this dream. The same dream has often visited me in my past life, appearing in different guises at different times, but saying the same thing. Socrates, it said, compose music and work at it. In the past, I used to suppose that it was encouraging me and cheering me on to do what I was doing, like those who cheer runners. I took the dream to be cheering me on in the same way to do just what I was doing, composing music, on the grounds that philosophy is the greatest music, and that was what I was doing. So one thing I want to challenge is to what extent Plato, the author, thinks that philosophy without the theory of forms, for those of you who are Plato students, is really philosophy. So was Socrates really doing philosophy? And Socrates is, again, this kind of traditional, more pious man, not very traditional, of course, for the Athenians, but by our standards, he's not so academic. But now, since the trial was over and the gods' festival was holding up my death, I thought that just in case the dream might, after all, be instructing me to compose music as commonly understood, I should not disobey it, but should start composing, for it seems safer not to depart not to die, before I had honored my sacred obligation by composing poems in obedience to the dream. So that is how I came to start by making a composition dedicated to the god whose festival was currently being held. But after I had attended to the god, I reflect that the poet, if he is to be a poet, should compose stories, not arguments. I myself was not a storyteller, not a myth maker. So I took the stories I had already to hand and knew those of Aesop and made compositions out of the ones that first came to mind. So I have 8 more minutes. So Plato makes Socrates underscore that he never had anything to do with myth making. And if you look at most of the major myths in Plato, like the myth of air at the end of the Republic, very important myth, someone else gave it to Socrates. And likewise with other myths, I think, we can discuss this, but what I'm trying to stress is that Plato wants his more, the inner circle of his audience to realize the contrast between Socrates, who was unable to make myths, and Plato, who is contributing to philosophy by making myths. And why is this important? Because it's through myth that Plato is developing the kind of natural science that Socrates and Plato had envisaged. And I'm wrapping up. I'm giving you my suggestion again. In the beginning of the Phaedo, Plato states that his teacher, Socrates, was a lover of mythoi, of myth, but not himself an expert in creating them. He introduces this claim in passing in the course of a story that sounds very realistic. Evenus, we don't care about him right now, but it's part of the the details that Plato wants us to absorb so that we believe the story. Evenus heard that Socrates composed verses and wanted to know why he did that. The story about Phaedo's dream, Socrates' dream, also indicates, this is my reading, that Socrates was not completely clear about whether philosophy, or rather his own practice of what he thought philosophy was about, so whether that fulfilled the god's command, make music and work at it. I already said that. So Socrates said, maybe this is not music, what the god thought of music. Maybe it was not philosophy. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Let's be safe before I depart. Let's make sure that we give the bloody dream some answer, right? Give them the myth. So I get my material from someone else because I myself am not a myth maker. When toward the end of the dialogue, Plato makes Socrates admit that someone else, according to sadly Plato himself, gave him, Socrates, the material for the eschatological myth, the reader can reflect on the earlier story regarding the dream, the verses Socrates composed, using Aesop's myth. So he turned to someone else. So Plato is the original thinker here, and the student of Socrates, and the one who was able to fulfill Socrates' vision or dream about natural science, which Plato casts in the form of a myth. Since Socrates was not himself a mythologikos, an expert in myth-making and storytelling, the reader can appreciate the invocation of his informant concerning the topography of the underworld as a statement about Plato's contribution to natural science, a contribution which, however, has been endorsed by his master, by Socrates, allowing Plato to properly claim, against the rival claims of his fellow Socratics, the heritage of his master. This is intra-Socratic polemics, the rivalry with other Socratics. What's at stake? We already discussed Socrates' intellectual autobiography. I said that we read the Phaedo as a manifesto on teleological natural science, which is not a reading that was very popular in antiquity because everybody I think, focused on dualism in the Phaedo. It's about the soul, the immortality of the soul. Yes, it's also about the immortality of the soul, but I think this is a vehicle for Plato to talk about his own contribution to natural science. Plato Socrates points to the constraints of early natural science. Unlike Xenophon, he doesn't say, no, never meddle with natural science. He says natural science has something to give us, but so far, no natural scientist has been able to do it. So please try to do it. The agenda of the Timaeus. Timaeus is the Italian statesman and scholar that Plato produces, comes across, and gives Socrates this marvelous story, which basically is the story of how a demiurge, a divine god, a divine creator, craftsman, used his power of intellect to persuade, as the text says, necessity, the necessary causes, material causes, to cooperate in the best possible way and give us the cosmos, the universe. I mentioned that Socrates is a student of Archelaus, so Aristophanes' satire is not completely in the air. I mean, the Athenians had reason to think Socrates as himself something like an atheist, maybe. And the last thing I want to stress, I already mentioned it, is Plato's own, it doesn't sound good these days, Plato's self-promotion, intra-Socratic polemics, how Plato was the best of and the most important of Socrates' students. And of course, who is the best of Plato's student? Aristotle, who is also the father of teleological explanations in physics and medicine, and then comes Galen, another important. So it's a very, very important contribution to the history of philosophy, teleological thought, and its debt is traced back to Socrates, of whom, interestingly and intriguingly, we know nothing about the historical Socrates, as I said in the beginning, but it's the saga which is still so important. And there are some suggestions, but I don't want to interrupt now for this. I will ask your professor to distribute this bibliography to you for anyone who wants recent books or references about Xenophon, about Archelaus, about Phaedo, about atheism in the 5th century, and of course, Sedley's book, which is likely translated in Chinese. I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised. Certainly, there is a book by Sedley not translated. Liu Wei told me that it was published in Chinese first before it was published in English. So I'm stopping my share function here. I hope you're still all there. And yes, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Okay, I'm happy to field the questions on your behalf, so you can just focus on the substance of the questions instead of managing the queue. To that end, anybody who wants to get into the queue, raise a hand either virtually or physically. It looks like we will be starting off with a question from Luke. If you could make sure the microphone in front of you is set.
Oh boy. Okay, can you hear me?
There you go.
Great. All right. So I think this is a wonderful reading. It's really strong, but maybe not quite bulletproof. For perhaps the only reason is that, regarding the historical character of Socrates, we don't really know too much about him, right? And because he may not fully be a fabrication of Plato, but Plato always introduces characters in his dialogues, and he's writing dialogues and not like a firm treatise. So there's never really explicitly Plato as a narrator himself giving us his position. It's always through a spokesperson. And I feel like that's maybe one issue that I have with your reading so far. That's really the only issue I have with it, genuinely speaking. I think this is something we should read into the other dialogues with.
Okay, so thank you very much. I want objections because this is a new thing, but I'm not sure what the objection is. So it's not Plato, but Plato, look, it's this dialogue where Plato says, I was not present. And of course, Socrates speaks, and what he says is, I'm not a myth maker, and I heard this from someone else. So what is your objection exactly?
That because Plato never presents himself as a narrator in any of these dialogues, we can't really nail down what his position is. And because he's written dialogues and not, official obvious treatises,
Yeah.
it's maybe a shaky connection point, is what I'm saying.
But why? I mean, you have an author who you have a film director, and he makes a big project of movies. Okay, you'll never ask what is his opinion. But you have someone like Plato. He establishes the academy. He develops this kind of science that he also advertises in the 7th book of the Republic, right? Maybe it has nothing to do with the academy, but I guess that's unlikely. It's Socrates introducing this very original program, which involves mathematics, this and that. Then there is this character that we know nothing about, Timaeus. Okay, maybe it was someone and it's a documentary. Why buy that? It's Plato's character. We know nothing independently of Plato, and it's a marvelous original story, which is the answer to what Socrates was looking for. I grant you, even if it's not Plato, if it's someone else, okay. But it is this marvelous story that gives the momentum to what Aristotle does afterwards with teleology. And I think the author wants to say it's us in the academy, even if it's not himself. Is this answering your question or not?
This is satisfying me, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Is there anybody else, virtually or in the room, who would like to ask a question, make a comment? Okay. Is there a microphone near you? Okay, we have a question now from
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your talk. It's very inspiring, and actually, I agree with your interpretation. But I just have a question. This is from political perspective, back to the date, because Socrates was in charge for the impiety, which is a very serious crime at that time, and also corrupting the youth. But now we just focus on the impiety. Do you think that your reading actually supports my questions? That do you think that Plato is making justifications of his teacher in order to make his impiety charge not so serious? Back to the he is the students of Socrates, and he is kind of making justifications of what his teachers was doing, and can bring him more not just kind of stop the bad influences that the charge that brings to his what should I call the academy, or the scholarship that he taught him. And then that's why he made the Themus story up, and then using Socrates
Which story up? Making which story up? I'm sorry.
The Themus, Timaeus.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote the story. He wrote Timaeus, and then that's why I use Socrates as the main characters and use him as to justify from the first person perspective, and then to tell the story that, oh, that actually is not an impiety. We kind of telling the myth to justify the theological thing. Do you think that is a kind of also consider this kind of political?
Very good question. The answer is no, because to say yes, we would have to we would be trapped in a problem of translation, because impiety, the charge is about Socrates not recognizing the gods of the city. So even if Plato and Xenophon convince us that Socrates was pious, it's by our standards of piety. It has nothing to do with what the Athenians expected. The Athenians thought he was a smart ass who didn't care about teleology. They thought this was all irrelevant to the polis. They were probably right also. That Socrates was part of this elite who didn't help Athens move out of the crisis, including Critias, the tyrant. And to some extent, Xenophon can be more compelling because Xenophon at least was a general. I mean, he did something more practical. They condemned Xenophon also, but for different reasons. They didn't like philosophers. There is an interesting, actually, relatively recent book called, I don't know if you're familiar with it, Calling Philosophers Names, which plays with this idiom in English. So like not being very respectful of philosophers. Everybody was suspicious of philosophers, sophists, everything. They just wanted to go back to their polis and run things in a pragmatic way. And who cares about why the world is like this? This is all for philosophers who build their academies outside the city. It's a huge discussion. I'm not saying I buy this, but I understand the worry. So, of course, to some extent, the Socratic apologetics is important and very crucial, but they're apologizing in the context of the inner circle of Socratics who were already Socratics. So for the average Athenian, just to say that, okay, he was not pious, but we are thinking of a different kind of piety, philosophical kind of piety that you Athenians don't understand anything about, who would buy that? That's an insult.
Okay, next I see a hand from Professor Hans-Georg Müller, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the interesting presentation. My question is probably similar to the previous one. I still don't fully get, just one question about the atheism thing. I mean, the Phaedo, I mean, obviously Socrates is not, affirming the Athenian religion, but obviously, I mean, also in the Phaedo passage, the famous one that's on the handout, it's this intelligent design position. How is that atheism?
But for the Athenians, that would still count as atheism. I think.
But I mean, for you, is intelligent? Why is
yes.
I'm not familiar with the scholarship.
Okay,
but
okay.
Is that like
yes.
is this position of intelligent design called in the scholarship today atheism by someone?
No, not in the scholarship today. No, but there is an equivocation. I think. Right. Okay. So thanks for the question. Yes, I think for the Athenians who condemned him for not recognizing their gods, that's the city religion, that philosophical idea of the divine was kind of irrelevant. He still didn't recognize his not.
Yeah, I understand.
I
understand that. I understand that.
From our point of view, yes, yeah. he was not an atheist. But and yes, for Plato, that's I'm glad you asked this question because I should add this. Plato gives us a very interesting yet philosophically problematic proof for the immortality of the soul in Book 10 of the Laws, which some people say that is still a criticism to Archelaus, some say it's to Democritus, all the natural scientists. And yes, this is against the atheists the way we understand it. But what I'm raising a doubt about is to what extent Plato's agenda was to persuade the Athenians in Socrates' time. I mean there is a language problem there. They're just using a different question. But the interesting thing from the point of view of the history of ideas is that we may think that the trial of Socrates has given rise to some very deep and interesting and influential philosophical questions that, yes, maybe they come out of the grief of his students who then built on their own, I think, ideas. And Xenophon's ideas tie in more. I omitted the passages from Xenophon's Memorabilia, which are our first probably texts on creationism. Again, Sedley describes this as religious creationism. This is book 1, I think, of the Memorabilia, where Socrates Socrates says to Aristodemus, you should believe in God, don't be an atheist, because an argument of design. But the agenda in Xenophon is very much much closer to religion. Some people think it's a historical Socrates. It's not completely irrelevant to my point. But Plato then builds on this kind of idea, which could be Xenophon's, could be Socrates. It's not so important, to give us the kind of argument that then Aristotle uses to move on to, he gets rid of the demiurge of the, he makes a completely different story about divinity, Aristotle, but he gives us this very important and wrong account of natural science, which is a teleological account. Aristotle's four causes go back to this effort to fight against common opinions about Socrates' atheism.
Okay.
So that, I think, is an interesting, intriguing story.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
There is still time for further questions or comments. Okay. I see another hand in the chat. Feel free to jump in.
Hi, Chloe. Γεια σου.
Γεια σου, Δήμητρα.
If Socrates says, I'm not a myth maker, what if we imagine him that he says it in the same spirit that he says, I'm not good with words in the beginning of the Apology?
Ironical. Yes.
What does, put it differently, what does the irony do to your reading? Or what doesn't it do? How is it relevant or irrelevant? Or
not in a way I can see, but maybe you can help me. Yes, I'm not. But what does it? How would that help us? Let's say it's ironical, and he's still a myth maker. Yes, I mean, part of my
there's no ambivalence in Plato. If he is not sure himself and he's trying out things, like he has this persona that says, I'm not a myth maker, well, he himself.
Yeah. But then you would expect, I think, for it to work, the irony in an essential and meaningful way, that there would be something that the author Plato builds on it. Whereas here we have nothing. And it's, if you look at this part of the text, that's why I said that the liar, if they are good liars, they have to be very, take care of the details. It's a story that you say, okay, so it was called that day. Who cares? It does nothing about the mind and body problem. So you buy it and you say, that's a nice anecdote of the last day of the. He doesn't build on it. And then what I've tried to do also is to go to the myths in Plato's dialogues. And as I said, very often, almost all the times, Plato goes out of his way to say that that Socrates invokes someone else, like air. And it's not a lot of myths, or some Italian in the Gorgias, the famous myth of the about incontinence. Some Italians say that. And so I would like to make this point that that Plato wants to show us that Socrates was not did not experiment himself with myth making. Possibly also this could be a difference from people like Prodicus, other sophists who used myth and allegories. And then Plato comes back with his allegories. Of course, we have the allegory of the cave, but yes, that's an allegory. On the other hand, it's not described. It's an eikon, actually. It's an analogy, right? We call it an allegory. Yeah. So also the use of allegories is interesting. In the beginning of the Phaedrus, Socrates attacks Phaedrus for trying to give different interpretations to traditional myths. But the myths come from from elsewhere. They don't come from Socrates, who doesn't know anything also. I mean, that's another way to approach it, that he doesn't know anything. And the ignorance, so Socratic ignorance. And one nice detail, which is not a detail actually about the Phaedo, is that toward the end of the dialogue, Socrates says, "No one who is sane would believe what I'm talking about."
Mhm. Yeah.
Which is so interesting, and it's so amusing also. But if you go by the traditional reading of the Phaedo being a preparation for death and all this sorrow there, which of course is part of his life, the last day on earth, but Socrates, Plato allows you to have a completely different reading, I think.
Yeah.
And methodologically, I mean, I like the question, but on the other hand, as I develop an interpretation, I think it's the more you're able, the more heuristic it is, the more things you can bring together and shed light on a part of Plato's strategy. If you can reconstruct it, then maybe you have something to say there.
Mm.
So if you could develop a counter interpretation built on irony, I would be very happy to have a debate.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Is there anyone else? There's still a bit of time. Well, if there are no questions or no further comments, I think we could come together again in thanking our speaker for their time.
Thank you very much. And hope to see you in Greece.
Yeah, it would be wonderful if you ever made it out to these parts. We would love to have you.
Okay.
Thanks again. Thanks again so much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Chloe.
everybody.
See you.